So the link between radiation and cancer has been established. This has been established both through laboratory, animal studies, and statistical studies of human populations exposed to radiation. The excess cancer risk can be determined by comparing the expected incidence of cancer in a control group that has not been irradiated to the incidence found in an irradiated population. In animal studies, we can have a clear difference between the control group and the experimental group. However, the statistical nature of epidemiological studies, that is, studying cancer incidence in human populations, can be challenging. In some instances, both the control and the experimental group might consist of non-diseased individuals. However, in other studies, the radiation is used to treat diseased individuals. And so you are comparing an experimental group that is both diseased and irradiated to a control group that is neither. Secondly, there are so many people who get cancer in the general population that a small increase in the number of these cancer cases may appear large, but be statistically insignificant. Thirdly, there are many carcinogens within our society, and because different people may be exposed to different carcinogens, it is difficult to say what part these other factors may play in any observed increase in cancer rates. Lastly, estimating the dose can sometimes be difficult, especially when the exposure is sudden and accidental. Let's look at classic study. The incidence of leukemia in male mice exposed to a total body X-ray radiation is shown from a paper by Upton published in 1961. The figure shows a characteristic increase in incidence over the low dose range, followed by a decrease in incidence after high doses. The reason that the incidence decreases at high doses is because the cells are being killed before they have a chance to transform into cancer cells. In other words, high doses of radiation kill cells before they can become cancerous. Radiation is leukemogenic, meaning that it causes leukemia in exposed individuals. This has been seen early on in occupationally exposed people, atomic bomb survivors, and ankylosing spondylitis patients treated with radiation. Ankylosing spondylitis is an inflammatory arthritis affecting the spine and large joints that many years ago was treated using radiation therapy. Radiation increases the incidence of only specific types of leukemia. Only acute and chronic myeloid leukemia have been found to be increased in irradiated individuals. This is not considered to be the case for lymphocytic leukemia. Lymphocytic leukemia develops from a type of white blood cell, and there is no evidence that exposure to radiation, chemicals, or chemotherapy increases a person's risk for this type of cancer. From 1950 to 1956, 117 new cases of leukemia were reported in the Japanese survivors, while approximately 64 of these can be attributed to radiation exposure. In Hiroshima, there were 61 leukemia deaths in a population where only 12 might be expected. And in Nagasaki, there were 20 deaths attributed to leukemia when only 7 might have been expected. In Nagasaki, 90% of the dose was from X-rays, while in Hiroshima, half of the radiation was X-rays and half were neutrons. This is thought to account for the differences in leukemia incidence between the two populations. The figure shows the excess relative risk as a function of colon dose for people who reach 70 after exposure at age 30. The solid straight line is the linear slope estimate. The dashed line is a smoothed estimate derived from the points. The excess relative risk, or ERR, is the relative risk minus 1. In other words, an excess relative risk of 1 would mean you are 100% more likely to get cancer. So if the risk was 20%, then an ERR of 1, the risk would now double to 40%. Estimates of the site-specific solid cancer ERR are shown for a range of cancers, with an average ERR just less than 0.5. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, therefore, are almost 50% more likely to get cancer than the general population. So if the chances in the general population is, say, 20%, then add 50% to this. So 50% of 20% is 10%. 20% plus 10% would be 30%. And the survivors will have a 30% chance of getting cancer as opposed to the 20% that might have been seen in the general population. We have already talked about the ankylosing spondylitis and how it is an inflammatory arthritis affecting the spine that was once treated with radiation therapy. From 1935 to 1944, approximately 15,000 patients were treated with both acute and fractionated doses ranging from 1 to 20 grays. In a 2-year follow-up of the patients, it was revealed that 7 people have leukemia, compared to an expected incidence of only 1. Obviously, this is not the ideal study for showing that radiation causes leukemia, because the population observed were initially ill and consisted mainly of men who are more susceptible than females to ankylosing spondylitis. A study of 425 radiologists in the United States who died between 1948 and 1961 revealed 12 cases of leukemia compared to an expected 4 cases. However, at the same time, a study of British radiologists revealed no excess leukemia incidence. It is now generally accepted that the incidence of leukemia in radiologists is no higher than in any other medical specialty, or for that matter, just in the general population. Between 1915 and 1931, watch dial painters known as the radium girls used to make their paintbrushes pointed by using their lips to press down gently and force the brush to a point again. The radium used to paint the clock faces was ingested by these workers, and because radium is a bone seeker, it accumulated in the skeleton, resulting in a continual exposure to the bone. Radium is chemically similar to calcium, which is why it accumulates in the bone, and while it is there, it emits alpha particles. Of the several hundred people who worked at the factory, approximately 40 developed osteosarcoma, which is a much greater incidence than you might expect. For over 500 years, miners working in Saxony had long been known to die early from a wasting lung disease known as mountain sickness. 20 years before radioactivity was detected, mountain sickness had been identified as a disease, which in 1924 was identified as lung cancer. It was a further 80 years before they knew this was due to radon, a radioactive gas, that seeps up from uranium deposits. Forced ventilation of the mines reduced the risk of developing cancer in the miners to almost insignificant values. Radon is a naturally occurring radioactive gas that can cause lung cancer and can be problematic here in Pittsburgh. Discovered by accident in 1984 because a construction worker working at Limerick Nuclear Power Plant in Pottstown by the name of Stanley Watrous set off their new radiation detectors. The power plant wasn't operational yet and didn't even have any radioactive material, so a team of experts went to his house and discovered radiation levels about 700 times higher than the maximum safe levels. In essence, the risk of cancer to his entire family from the radon that was in his home was equivalent to smoking a couple of hundred packs of cigarettes a day. I guess the question is, have you tested your house for radon? The man pictured here is Paul Nakadani of Red Valley, Arizona. He is one of 150 Navajo uranium miners who worked at the uranium mine in Shiprock, New Mexico until 1970. They inhaled dust containing radioactive material. 133 of these 150 miners died of lung cancer or pulmonary fibrosis by 1980. Pulmonary fibrosis is a lung disease that occurs when lung tissue becomes damaged and scarred. Prior to the 1930s, children with thymic enlargement, a benign condition that might indicate something more serious, underwent radiation therapy of the thymus. Doses ranged from 1.2 to 60 grays and resulted in a 100-fold increase in the incidence of thyroid cancer in these children. Children of the Marshall Islands who were accidentally exposed to fallout radiation from nuclear tests also had increased incidence of all types of thyroid disease, including tumours. And an increased incidence of thyroid cancer was also seen in survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who were children at the time of the bombings. The latent period of this radiation induced cancer appears to be between 10 and 20 years, but was seen quite early on after the Chernobyl accident due to children drinking milk contaminated with radioactive iodine. In terms of breast cancer was observed in the female survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In addition, Canadian women with tuberculosis that were subject to multiple fluoroscopies, those X-ray movies, also developed breast cancer. This was before drugs were developed to treat tuberculosis, and they used to carefully collapse the lung to improve blood flow, and fluoroscopies enable them to closely monitor the collapsing lung. The plot shows the incidence of breast cancer as a function of the number of fluoroscopies, and the data can be reasonably fitted with a straight line, supporting the linear no threshold model, at least for higher doses. Whether radiation exposure during fetal life causes an increase in the incidence of cancer has been largely debated. Crucially, Japanese children irradiated in utero during the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima have shown no incidence of childhood cancers. That said, a number of children presented with microcephaly and severe mental retardation. Children exposed in weeks 8 to 15 and 16 to 25 had significantly reduced IQs. A couple of earlier studies, both in the UK and US, found that there was an increase in cancer rates for children who were exposed to radiation in utero. In particular, one study found that the odds ratio for childhood cancer deaths was 1.23, where the odds ratio is the chance of exposure divided by the chance without exposure. So 1.23 would be a 23% increase. However, issues were found with some of these studies when they were later reanalyzed. So how does radiation cause cancer? Well, it seems unlikely that chromosomal changes would just happen to produce the specific changes required for cancer to develop. Instead, carcinogenesis has been associated with either the inactivation of tumor suppressor genes or the activation of oncogenes. Normal proto-oncogenes play a role in the regulation of cell division, but can become mutated and contribute to the development of a cancer. We know that there is a direct evidence that cancer occurs at relatively low doses of radiation. The issue is whether an electron, which is liberated by the X-ray radiation, will have to cause damage in one location, or whether or not it has to cause damage in two locations in order for the cell to become cancerous. Typically, if the damage occurs in two locations, then that might lead to cell death, as we saw earlier in the course. However, cancer is related to the cells that survive. This is why the linear no threshold model makes more sense, as the quadratic term in a linear quadratic model would be due to the need for two hits to come from different particles of radiation. The hormetic response is a curious effect that has been seen in some animal studies. For example, one study found that mice lived for 50 days longer after being exposed to 500 millisieverts of X-rays. However, this is not reproducible, and a similar study found that the mice actually lived 75 days less after being irradiated. One possible explanation for this is that the X-rays caused a reduction in other infections. However, it is not even clear if this effect is real. If it is real, then it is probably more to do with an enhancement of the immune system than the radiation stimulating the body into repairing existing DNA damage, as was kind of hoped. Next video, we'll talk about mutation.